Very good. Good evening. I'd like to call to order the Finance Committee of February 2nd, 2022 at 6 p.m. First item on the agenda is public appearances, non-agenda items. We have none. Third item, action items. Motion to approve Resolution R-18-22 adopting the ARPA TID number 6 closure investment plan.
I move approval.
Motion made by Alder Wheeler, and I think I'll kick it off by having Misty Dodge, our Director of Finance, speak. So go ahead, Misty, you have the floor.
Yeah, so first I'd like to say, just for clarification, that your approval tonight is subject to future council amendments and the rest of the process that we've outlined. So approving it tonight does not mean that's the final document, just for clarity. So I thought we would start by I'll go through the logistics, a really recapped version of what we went through at Committee of the Whole about what we're doing, and then we'll kick it off to Mayor Richardson to talk about the priorities. So to start, I have my screen shared, just for those of you that are wondering where this document is available. The easiest way to get to it is on the City of Fitchburg's webpage, under Government, and then Departments, Finance. That's where you'll get to all of our stuff. Financial reports and records and reports over on the left, and then the ARPA TID closure is the second section here. So this is where you would find the schedule. The slides from the presentation I did are here. The mayor's proposed investment plan is here. And then once we get further in the process, the council amendments will be available at the same location, as well as the final adopted plan when we get to that point. So that's where you can find it. Looking at the actual document, I like to use bookmarks. I find that the easiest way to get around. Granted, this is a much shorter document than some of the other things we deal with, but I still think they're helpful. So to get to those in this PDF version, there's a little bookmark icon on the left, and you can see each one of these are grouped, are linked here, so you can get to it pretty easy. So for those of you that haven't read this document yet, a great place to start would be that introductory letter from the mayor. I'll talk a little bit about the initial parts of it. So we did have that Committee of the Whole meeting a couple weeks back now. The slides are available as an appendix to this document. But the purpose of this investment plan is really the precursor to the CIP and the budget process. So with ARPA, we are expected to get $3.2 million. According to Treasury, we are intended to use that on fighting the pandemic, supporting the families and businesses struggling, maintain vital public services, and then building a strong, resilient, and equitable recovery. And then there's 4 eligible uses for the money: replacing the lost public sector revenue. This is where we talked about how there's that $10 million standard allowance. So the city could elect to take our full standard allowance, which means the full amount of the money that we will receive, we could then use for the provision of government services, which is a much more flexible category. There's 3 other eligible uses as well. There's responding to the far-reaching public health and negative economic impacts, providing premium pay for essential workers, and or investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So those are the big broad categories. And especially as you're looking at what this providing government services is, there are probably a literal million different ways that we could spend this money. So the purpose of this investment plan is not to say this is the exact amount that we're going to spend on each project. We're going to narrow the scope from that literal million down to 35 or 50, so that we can use our staff resources in a better way. So by adopting this investment plan, you'll be saying these are our top tier priorities, and then you'll direct staff to research more of the logistics, what it means, get these programs in front of you guys as more of a authoritative motion. This is just that 30,000 foot view. We also are getting about $2 million from the TID 6 closure. So TID 6 is the one over at McKee, in the Target area. We are going through the process currently to wind down that successful TID. And even after we've completed some pretty significant projects in that TID, we will have excess increment generated. That money that's left once we go through the final audit will get allocated amongst all of the overlying jurisdictions, and the city is expected to get about $2 million. So since both of these pots of money are really unique items, large amounts of money, very unique, should be spent on kind of one-time strategic purposes. That's why we're doing this initial step of the investment plan. So in the document as well, one other thing I want to point out is the Treasury's overview of the final rule is included in here as well. That's like a 40-page document if somebody wanted to see more information about the ARPA piece of this. And then the TID part, there's TID reports available out on that same website that we had there as well. So that's kind of the big picture process stuff. At this point, I will turn it over to Aaron unless you have process questions for me before we go.
I don't believe so. No.
All right, then I can go next. And first talk a little bit about priorities. Some of them are pretty obvious. One is exposure to COVID-19 and making sure that we're doing everything we can to protect the community and protect staff. And so there's a lot of things in here that will help in regards to battling COVID-19. Another area is trying to leverage the funds we have, but avoiding duplication as well. There's a lot of other programs out there right now that are for a wide variety of things, and there's going to be more that probably come out. And we want to make sure that we have funds available if there's matching requirements for those things and taking advantage of that extra money as much as we can. Because if we can get an extra $250,000, $500,000, that's fantastic, and we should have the funds available to leverage those things. And so there's already some things we know that are out there. There's probably more that will be coming. And we also don't want to duplicate other programs, other services offered by the county, the state, things like that. If those things are happening, then why duplicate those services? Let's utilize our money for additional things that aren't already being provided by someone else. So I thought that that was an important piece as well as we're looking at what we want to do. A big thing for me as well is providing efficient and accessible services for the residents of the city. You know, I think that there's a lot of things we can do better. There's a lot of processes that are pretty old and dated. And so I think that we can make some investments, especially in some software and a few other things as well, to really do a better job of providing high quality services to our residents and also providing things that are also just more 21st century. There's some older processes that are still probably from when we were a town, or maybe not quite that old, but some pretty old things. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement in how we provide services to our residents and to even business owners and council members and staff. And so I think that there's some good opportunities there as well. Another big thing for me is future financial flexibility. So there is a lot of limitations we have with levy limits and all kinds of other requests and requirements and needs that we have. And so if we can strategically use these funds to advance projects that create additional flexibility, I think we should do that because there's always new things that come up. You know, for instance, the salt shed that ended up being rusted out and we had to replace. That came out of nowhere, and that's like $400,000, $500,000, something like that. That's pretty significant. And so those things happen every year. And so the more flexibility we can have for those unknown expenses, the better. Because that wasn't in a CIP, that we didn't know until all of a sudden we went, oh no, the base of this is terrible, and we need this as a safety thing, we need to do this. So if there's things that we can do with this money to then take essentially money off of whether it's borrowing or future tax levies so that we have that flexibility, I think we should do that. And if we don't need it when those budgets come up, great, because I know people on the council will find ways to use that money when that happens. That's never a problem. Right. And I think that just goes to the planning for the future. And I think that things like we talked about with the South Sonora Prairie Neighborhood Plan, Greenfield Neighborhood Plan, you know, we need to keep growing as a city, and we need to set ourselves up for that long-range plan and that future, and so we continue to do those things. There's one point in time where we probably went too long before getting a new neighborhood plan in place, and So our new housing starts and things like that were too low, and that really impacts our ability to continue providing great services. So there's things like that in here as well, as you'll see. And then the last thing is sustainability. And I think that's a big piece. That's something we've talked a lot about on here, and I know certain people have talked a lot about it as well. And so that's an important thing. And so some of the things we've talked about, and I put these in here because I think it's really important. And it's things like, you know, the B-cycle program, replacing lighting to LED lighting. There's a huge energy savings we can provide and some of those things as well. And so you'll see some of that stuff in here as well. So, you know, those are kind of some of the main things that I looked at for priority. I didn't get all the ideas that people suggested, but I got a lot of them in here. So hopefully everyone sees a number of things that they were shooting for and wanting in there as I did this. And so we do have 10 different groups, I guess you could say. They're no particular order. There's no priority to them. They're alphabetical. And so I can go through those different things. Before I do, is there anything that Misty or Chad want to add?
The only thing I'd like to add is along those lines, I think I mentioned it before too, is when you look at the groups that Aaron included as planned, it added up to 5.5 million. We're only expecting to get 5.2. That doesn't mean that in order for you guys to put in new initiatives, you have to take something out. Again, this is that top level priority. Just want to make sure we're at least kind of in the ballpark as things get figured out. However, if there's something from a policy perspective that you disagree with, those are the types of things that you would want to make sure that you get taken out. You know, don't waste staff resources exploring something that council doesn't ultimately support. So I think that's in there. The other thing that's not in here that I forgot to mention is we didn't identify years. So we don't expect all of this money to get spent in 1 year. That's unrealistic. We do have quite a bit of time between when we have to spend the money or we have to give it back. So there's the benefit of time. We just don't know how these different priorities are going to shake out based on available resources. So that just isn't available in the plan. We'll shake that out as we go through the CIP and the budget process.
Chad, anything you want to add? This one? All right. Yeah, and I think, you know, Misty brought up right now there's roughly $5.5 million of projects in here. We don't want $10 million of stuff, but, you know, I do think there are some things I put in here that probably won't happen, frankly. I mean, and I understand that, and I'll, you know, maybe talk to those when we hit those things. But with that matching opportunities and additional programs that are out there and available, there might be something that comes up that says, hey, you know, if you want to do something along these lines and you've got a project ready, we have funds available, and we can go, geez, wow, maybe we can do this thing for half or less than what we originally thought. So, you know, there are some things that I guess are a little aspirational. We don't want a ton of that stuff on here, but I think that is important to have some of those things, because even if we realize that they're not probably going to be a priority and we're not going to have the money to do it, you never know. You know, maybe they come up with even more ARPA funds. Who knows? We don't know what the future holds. So, yeah, go ahead, Gabriella.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm curious about the estimating for the money. Did you just work with staff on that, or is it truly just kind of I mean, I assume some of them are more accurate than others, but how did you do that? And then also, for Misty, how do you want us to do that for anything that we propose?
Yeah, I mean, staff were to, go ahead, Misty, yeah.
So some of them are more specific. You know, the earmarks from the budget, we had very specific numbers for. The other ones I would say are more back of the napkin kind of numbers. So we knew more or less what we wanted to do. We have ballpark costs for it, but it very much so is not a solid number. It's not a budget. You know, it's a ballpark at this point. And as you're putting together your amendments, I'd request the same type of a thing. You know, is it going to be 50,000, 500,000, or 5 million? Like, what is that kind of ballpark that we should be looking at?
Another question from Alder Wheeler. Go. You have the floor.
Yes, who's going to be in charge of making sure that we're not duplicating services, is my first question.
The council is going to be. So there is a lot of, speaking of ARPA in particular, there is a lot of ARPA programs that are out there already through the state and through the county. There are some websites available that we could look to see what programs those are that are out there already. That's where the recommendation would be not to duplicate those. But ultimately, I mean, council could say that they wanted to duplicate them.
I think another piece to it too is because this is a multi-year plan and we're not going to spend all this money in a year, there are some things that we could implement over a number of years. So for instance, if we want to provide more money for hybrid vehicles, we could do maybe $10,000 for next year. And then if we buy some vehicles or we see a bigger need, then next year we can do another 10,000 maybe. You know, it's something where if we do it once, it doesn't necessarily mean, depending on what it is, that it falls off. You know, we can only, there's some things like buying new microphones for Fact TV that we're not going to do that every year probably, unless people are really rough with them. But there are some things like the hybrid vehicle program where, you know, we could start with 10,000 this year and then do another 10,000 next year and kind of see where the budget is and what their needs are. So that's, I think, another piece too.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point too, if I can add on to that, is this is a living document, right? This is our first kind of cut at what those top level priorities are. Every April, I have to file a report with the Treasury to identify how we spent the ARPA money in particular. And so after that report is filed, May or June-ish, in anticipation of CIP, I will go through this document and kind of true it up. You know, what we've already spent, what we've already identified, and then if there's either extra capacity available for a new priority or maybe some other things need to be reduced. So we'll kind of use this as a framework going forward too, and we'll continue to update it as time goes on.
Very good. There's a question from, yes, Alder Rada. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening. My question is, I was thinking that maybe we should revise this document like every 6 months. You know, I know that CIP time is going to be a good time to revise this document to determine, because I know that we are going to apply for a lot of grants. And then to have, you know, a revision of the document periodically to determine if some of these that some of the projects here are going to be funded with other sources, you know, like grant money. And then we can remove it from the list and maybe we can add other ones that they, you know what I mean? So my question is, can we have that flexibility? Can we do that? Like have a revision of this document, like maybe every 6 months?
So the plan right now would be to do that revision you're talking about every year. If you wanted to do it more frequently, we could. We'll just have to make sure it works in with the rest of the processes that we go through, CIP and budget-wise.
I'd say there really isn't a need to do it more than once a year because this really feeds into the CIP, which feeds into the general budget, operating budget. So really once a year, I think should be plenty because I don't know why you'd revise it in 6 months when you're in the middle of the rest of the budgeting, and it takes time to do that.
Right.
Jen?
Good point.
And one consideration is, you know, as staff works down the priorities that the council has identified, it could very well take 6 months or longer to even work through a priority. So there may not be a lot of changes that happen over a 6-month period, and it might be more appropriate to do that 1-year update. Obviously, if, you know, we're working on an initiative and it comes in significantly under estimate, for instance, you know, that's something we could bring back to the council, at least as an update, which then may trigger, you know, maybe a revision earlier than a year, or else at least beginning to think about, okay, in 2 months, let's just say the 1-year update is coming, so you can start to think about how you might want to reapportion that available funds.
And to reiterate what Misty said, not all these things are going to happen in a year. We're not going to spend all this money in a year. So even if something comes under a budget, that doesn't mean we can do a whole lot more that year because we still have a limited amount of staff opportunity to do that. So,
Sure. Alder Herbst, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, for Misty in this regards, more the TED. Getting that money from the TED, you know, the taxpayers been paying to plow the roads and take care of the streets and everything. Can some of that be set aside for the future, you know, like slurry seal or resurfacing that we have to do in the TID district, you know, that you know, takes a pretty good beating from some pretty heavy traffic so that the other taxpayers, you know, don't have to pay for that again in the future? Can that be set aside? Again, excuse my ignorance for the process.
Yes, it absolutely can. You also bring up a good point that the TID money is extra property taxes that were collected from taxpayers across the city while the TID was open. So one of the things we're going to want to look at is making sure that we match that TID funding with property tax funded projects. Because, you want to match who paid in this surplus to who will benefit from not having to spend other money because of that available surplus. So that's a great point that I'm glad you brought up. Then as far as setting it aside, absolutely we can. So we could, or through one of these initiatives, you could say we want to set aside a certain amount for whatever project in whatever specific area. But you also don't have to limit it to the TID. So you could, in theory, do it for, like you said, slurry something. Now I'm ignorant. Slurry something could be done across the entire city because it was property taxes across the city that created this excess increment. So either way could work.
Since it was all of the residents of Fitchburg city property taxes, it could be, for instance, slurry, road surfacing, but then you could prioritize it from there, worst to better. I mean, I would think that to me, that just sounds much more reasonable.
Yep, so you could, for example, we have our standard resurfacing project that we
Right.
do. We could put extra money into that project to do more streets faster so that we can get through more of the needs that we have in a sooner amount of time.
Yep.
That would be an option.
Additional questions before we move on? Go ahead.
All right, I can start going through the different groups. First one is pretty quick and easy. It's the administrative cost piece. We're allowed to set aside 10% of funds for the administration of this, and that could be things like coordinating projects, monitoring, reporting, auditing, things like that, even applying for grants with some of the TID funding maybe. So something we're allowed to do and something that just makes sense as we try to do these things. So we have that available. If we don't use it, then at some point we'll say, yeah, we've got extra here to use in other projects, but it makes sense to set it aside for now since we can. Gives us, again, flexibility in the future. Number two is a big thing for me. It's improving city facilities. The building's getting a little older, especially City Hall, and so there's a few things that make a lot of sense. One is a better counter both in the main entrance to City Hall and in the top entrance to City Hall, or the top floor of City Hall. Right now, on the first floor, there are gates that can bring down at night, but that's not very secure. There's not any COVID precautions. And upstairs, there's nothing for gates. The door can lock, but the reality is that there's times where there's not even someone at those front cubicles, and someone would go upstairs and just jump the counter if they wanted to. And so we want to add some safety and security for staff, and that provides also some COVID pieces to that. But then along with that, the chiller at the library needs to be replaced. We've had some issues having to get that repaired already, and so we want to really needs to be replaced. It's at the point where we need to probably get a better system there, and then something down in the fitness center downstairs is just improve the flooring down there because there's a lot of employees that use that, and that flooring is not great. And then the next one is infrastructure, and this is where something like if you want to do more street resurfacing, that could be in there. A lot of stormwater projects on here. We've talked about those, and there's needs throughout the city for that. And I did put some street resurfacing in here, and maybe a focus on, I put in here anyway, a focus on roads within the qualified census tracts, as we're trying to, again, provide that equity, help out all of our communities, making sure we're doing that, make sure that that is an option. Town of Madison that we're getting would be one of those areas as well, so it could be in that area, but there's plenty of other parts of the city where that could be the case. Broadband is a big thing for the rural area, so that's especially in the rural area. But there are probably a few other parts of the city as well that could be improved. And so if we can get some funds for that, that'd be great. Matching for any other types of things. Putting a water fountain out at Hugo Jamestown, and then this is the last one for a reason. Finish off the bike lanes on. It says Remainder of Whaling Road. It's really from Fish Hatchery Road to Verona. If you've ridden on there, there's parts where the bike lanes actually aren't there. And so it's something where this is a low priority. That's the lowest on the list. This is something that probably won't happen, but as these programs come forward, I think it's a good thing to at least have on there as we're trying to be a gold medal city for biking. I think that's a nice piece, and that's a road that is not very safe because of the traffic on that road and that stretch of road anyway. So it's something that I know in the past people have wanted to do, and we've made it better, but there's still gaps. And so that's something that I thought, at least to have it on here, again, low priority. It's, if we happen to have a program that comes forward or a bunch of other stuff we don't need as much money for, but that's one that there's no way to designate on here. That's why I put it last, but it's low priority. So, Gabriella?
That's really interesting, and that was one of the questions I guess I had overall, was about the prioritization of it. And I do think, I do have a couple ideas that I might bring forward as amendments, but some of them I consider lower priority. Like, I would only want to spend that money if we didn't already have higher priority things paid for. So is that something you want me to explain in the description of the item? Like, is that, in Mayor, I don't see that that's a low priority in the actual text of the document. Is that something we should clarify? Or do you see this as something that would happen during the CIP process, or we're putting things on a time horizon?
Exactly. It would happen through the CIP and then the budget process. But it is helpful, at least during this discussion, for staff to hear what your priorities are. That'll help direct us to make sure we're operating at the top priorities first.
And we did go through and try to do that actually because priority, because I did think of that myself. But really in this document, there's only 2 or 3 that probably are that low, at least in my mind, that are nice to haves, but not things that we should do or we need to do. And so there's so few things that kind of went, well, let's just put, it's not really in an order, but the ones that are low, and I'll talk about those when we see those low in the order. So.
If I may, the other thing I'd like to point out is so there was a relatively vague statement about federal match or match for other federal funds. In the description, it talks about a variety of different projects that could actually be applied to. So that includes things like the broadband, the solar, the EV charging stations, senior transportation, B-cycle, all of those types of projects are identified in here. Obviously, it will be dependent upon what grants we're successful receiving, but that's where a lot of those bigger picture projects are identified.
We do have a question from Alder Arata. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment. Can we, in this group you call city infrastructure, can we have different buckets? You know, like we talk about city infrastructure, like one is road, one is broadband, could be park system, you know, so can we do that to categorize this city infrastructure? And then my other question about the matching, what happens if we want to bring amendment that we don't need the matching? You know what I mean? Like, what do we need to bring for EV charging station? Why do we need to have matching, you know, for a grant? Can we, you know what I mean? So can those type of possible infrastructure project can be also without matching, or, you know, what is this thought process here?
Yeah, so these projects don't need to have matching, but a lot of them do have matching opportunities. So there's not a requirement that there's matching for any of them to happen. And in terms of the different buckets, there's already, I think, 9, and I guess it just gets too unwieldy. If there's 15, 20, it can get out of control pretty quick. So that's why we tried to be as broad as we could in some of these buckets.
Go ahead, Alder.
Thank you. And I know this, you probably don't know, but the federal infrastructure bill, I assume some of these things like broadband and electric vehicle charging stations, those are all parts of the bill from what I understand. So I assume that we might know, like before we would pay for any broadband infrastructure, we would hopefully have a sense of what federal funds would be coming in to the city.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So the hope would be that we would apply for a variety of projects through that additional funding. And then most of the federal grants do have a match requirement. So that's where we would use this funding in order to leverage to get that bigger funding. But the plan would be to use those as much as possible in parallel in a combination to get those much larger projects completed.
Additional questions before we move on? Seeing none, go ahead.
Mr. Chad, anything before I go to group 4?
I was just going to add, I think that's one of the pieces where that, can't recall if we've covered it already, but like a grant consultant or grant writing consultant, we just know there's so much money out there that could be available to help stretch these dollars that while staff is trying to stay on top of the available grant opportunities that have already come out, there's just such an immense amount that we really want to try to maximize that, and that's one of the reasons why we have added that in there to help with all of those potential things coming from the infrastructure bill in particular and other sources.
All right, I can go to group number 4. And those are the things we kind of earmarked during the 2022 budget that we wanted to do. And so those are all in there. Those are things that we've taken out and said, oh, we're going to, do this in the ARPA and the TID projects. So those are all those projects right there. All of them, I think, are really important and great ideas and things that need to be done. You should be familiar with those since we talked about them. Anything, Chad or Misty? All right. I can go to 5, and that's planning for growth. And so that's a few things. One is the neighborhood planning for Greenfield, and the South Southern Prairie one was in the earmarks. That's why it's not in this one, because that was one of the things that I heard people say, yes, I absolutely support that in the next budget. So that's why it's not here. Technically, it's also planning for growth, but also for Greenfield, the Greenfield area. And we talked about that and the need to continue to think about our future. So I think it's an important piece. And then another couple things that we thought are important as we continue to grow is an organizational structure study and also a staffing plan, because there's a lot of needs as we continue to grow, and we've added a lot of positions and did a lot of that through the town of Madison, the plan for town of Madison. We're going to continue growing as a city. There's going to continue to be big needs in the city, and so where does it make sense, where there's opportunities for efficiencies, where there's opportunities to, does it work with other municipalities on some services as well? And so I want to make sure that we really are doing what we can and have the right people in the right roles, and long-term have those things kind of set up as well. So I thought it might help to get those things set up. Misty or Chad, anything else you want to add to that?
I'll just add with those studies in particular that, I think that, we may not be where we want to be currently as it relates to staffing levels and organizational structure within the city. And I see this as a really good opportunity for us to take a more of a strategic view on this and look to set the city up both in structure and staffing conversation, for the next 5 to 10 years as we look at what's a city of 35,000 look like and what's a city of 40,000 look like. These documents and studies could help guide the process along, provide an outside perspective on what's been working in other communities of similar size that we're likely to be in the next 5 to 10 years, and hopefully allow councils to make informed decisions during budget processes, particularly as it relates to staffing. I know that that's been a conversation piece based on last year's budget about a desire for the city to do more at least 5-year planning on staffing needs, so that helps the council potentially avoid some of those 11 o'clock midnight conversations and decisions during the budget process. So I think those 2 documents in particular could be very beneficial for the city in the long run.
Yeah, I think ideally, if you could do something for a staffing plan, like a CIP, where you have a rough idea of what positions you're looking to add over the next 5 years, I think that'd be great, as we're looking long-term. And those things can change a little bit, but if you have a rough idea of what those needs are, I think that'd be great to look long-term, so it doesn't at least seem reactive. I think that some people have always kind of had an idea in their head on what to do, but if it's written down on paper and other people can see it, it seems more proactive, and I think it helps just everyone to hopefully be on the same page or close to the same page.
Any questions? Yes, Alder Rada-Frada, go ahead.
Okay, regarding the organizational structure study, I think the city did a study a couple of years ago. Do you remember? It was maybe 2006, 2007. Do you remember that? I remember reading that document, but I don't remember.
There was a staffing study done as part of the space needs, although that was not the primary function of the
that's
space
another one.
needs, and that was in 2013 or 2014. There was at least some conversation related to that, but I'm not aware of any other staffing study that's been done in the city.
Yes, it was done. I can find it and share with you. So.
Additional questions? Hearing none, go ahead. Mayor.
All right, Group 6, I think is another pretty easy one, and it's really providing resources for PPE and things to combat COVID-19. And so it's masks and safety and cleaning and that type of stuff. Again, something that will probably be over a few years as we continue to replenish those supplies, but important things as we continue to battle this. And hopefully in a couple of years, COVID's gone on the way and we don't need to worry about that, but I'm not holding my breath, so. I can keep moving. I'm guessing that Chad and Misty are good on that one. That was a pretty easy one. Bucket 7, this is an important one again as we're looking for the future, and that's some process improvement initiatives. And it's a lot of software and training. You know, I think one of the things I think is really valuable for the city if we did diversity, equity, inclusion training for all staff. I think that's something that we have some of that, but it hasn't been something we've done necessarily on a staff-wide level. And if we could do a big all staff training for that would be fantastic. But there's also then a lot of software things that are in here. One thing that's actually been in the CIP is a new financial system. And that's something where, again, that creates flexibility. If we can use ARPA or TID funds for that instead of having to borrow for that, whenever that happens, that it enables us to have some flexibility in borrowing in the future. And it's something that I think is one of many processes. And there's a few other ones on here you can see with GIS and budgeting and open records. That's a huge piece. I mean, our clerk's department spends a ton of time just trying to fulfill open records requests, and it's too manual right now. And so if we can get a system that is a lot more automated, that alone could save just a ridiculous amount of time, sadly, because there are more requests than you think. And so I think there's just huge, huge opportunities in all of these. And so that's why those are all in here. I don't know if there's anything specific that, I mean, Misty obviously cares a lot about the financial reporting system, but I think all departments heads should because all of them are going to need it.
Right. The only thing I would add is that the CIP, the financial system, has been in the CIP for a long time, and it's even identified in there that we should look at TID closure funding to pay for it. So while this is a relatively big dollar amount for this group, the bulk of that has already been kind of talked about and earmarked through the CIP process, just not specifically.
Chad, anything?
I'll again say that this is a great opportunity to, again, address deficiencies that we already have in the city as it relates to processes and interaction with our constituents, with the services that they provide. An easy example might be things like a development application or a building permit, to be able to automate those, make the processes more efficient than they currently are. And again, this is something that's looking, again, to address current deficiencies, but set us up for the city that we're becoming of 35, 40,000. Again, taking more of that strategic view.
These are one of those many things that we're probably way behind on. And so if we can modernize and get into 2022 with some of this stuff, that'd be fantastic. And we probably need to. Any questions on this one before I go to the next group?
I don't see any. Go ahead.
So the software, those other software packages besides the financial system, are they just too low dollar amount to be in the CIP already, or is?
So generally, software wouldn't be in the CIP.
Okay.
So the financial system is because it's such a large enterprise-wide software, but usually the other ones would just be part of an operating budget.
All right, this is so fascinating though, because I guess they were probably part of, because the budget process, it's interesting because we see some of the staff requests that don't get funded because it's not possible. And that's really interesting for us to see like things that are on the horizon. But I do feel like there are parts of the city that are like wish list things that we don't necessarily get insight into because they don't meet the CIP criteria, or I don't know. It's kind of interesting to know. This is fascinating to see the types of things that have been in discussion that maybe the council wasn't privy to for just, logistical reasons, so.
Well, I think if it's in a request, even if I don't put in the budget, that still comes forward when they present their budgets, and they do talk about, this was in here, didn't make it through. So that is provided. Now, there might be things that people don't put in there, but we hear things about, I think Jill at the senior center wants a big patio area, which would be great outside the senior center. There's a cost to it. So I think some of those have been out there. It's not like I'm cutting things out and no one hears about them or anything like that. They do come through even if they're not funded in that system. All right, I can move to the bucket 8 then. And these are our sustainability initiatives. And so there's a lot of things on here. And I think this is an area that we'll probably see other things added in the future because more things might come forward. But phase 2 of the sustainability plan, we funded phase 1 in this year's budget. And I think that there's opportunity for that second phase that we talked about during the budget process. LED lights in a number of city buildings and rooms would be a huge, huge piece that we could really improve. The B cycle, expanding it and having that second phase we talked about happen right away. And we talk about equity, a lot of those places in that second phase were in some of our like healthy neighborhoods, for example, more like the far west side of the city, the northern side of the city, adding more locations in some of those areas. And so I thought that's something that I think we need to do right away. And so if we can put in some money to expand that immediately instead of doing it in a multi-year, I think that's a great thing. Some bus shelters, here's the more money for electric hybrid fleet. Another thing I put in here was something some of you might be familiar with. It's university, and it's something through the UW system where they have I think it's grad students work on a project that we come up with. And it could be anything. I don't know what that would be right now. I think there's lots of great ideas on what that could be. But as we're looking, again, for long term, we're trying to get ideas and on some of the big things that we're talking about, that might be a great resource to utilize for one of these projects. Communities throughout the state have actually used them on some things. If you read your Wisconsin Municipalities magazine, they talked about this in there actually. And so putting some funding in for something like that I thought would be a real good thing as well, as we're looking at lots of things that we want to do as a city. Anything, Misty or Chad? Questions?
We have one question from Alder Gerhart.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
So you have I just was noticing the document, so there's a total amount, so I assume that there's a theoretical earmark for each one of these items. Is that, because some of these we have a sense of what they cost. I guess I don't know, it's just not included in the document. Is there any way for us to, because I think the university, there's a specific financial.
It can vary, actually. It depends on what you want to do. So it could be, I think, from $25,000 up to $150,000. So it really is depending on the scope of the project.
So really, this is designed as kind of a block of money that would be distributed amongst these things. So it's not really earmarked within the.
Correct. Okay. Yeah. We have a rough idea, like we talked about before, but it's not $20,000 for this, $50,000 for this. There is some flexibility in there, and if one of these things is not a high priority for councils as we go through it, then maybe they get zero or they get $5,000. I don't know what is going to come out of that, but I think it was important just to have a rough idea. And like we've talked about, as things happen, that doesn't mean in the future we can't go over 300,000. That's not that's the last dollar you get and you're done.
So for the Alder amendments, is it going to be a separate part of the final document where it's like the Alder amendment section, or are we supposed to add these under these priority lists if they fit well under the priority lists?
Yep, so there's 2 council amendment forms. One if you wanted to create a new group. So it's like another overarching kind of principle thing, you would create a new group. Or if you had something you wanted to add to the list within an existing group, there's a separate form for that. Either add to the list or take out of the list. There would be a change in existing group form for that too.
Great, thanks.
Additional questions before we move on? All right. Seeing none, go ahead.
All right. Group 9 is, again, technology, but it's really for virtual meetings and telework. And so that's Zoom licensing, it's for staff that work remotely, it's for hybrid meetings like OWLs, the equipment in this room, I believe in here, up in the Jeannie Sealand room, to make sure that we can, again, keep providing what we're doing for our residents at least long term. I don't think that the idea of having Zoom available is ever going away. Even if we have to start coming in person, we still want to provide that for people that can't make it into City Hall. And so we want to make sure we've got great equipment so that happens, and that's easier for Fact TV to actually manage these meetings, because right now they have to have 2 people at all the meetings. And I think with some of these upgrades, the idea is that they can have 1 person running the meetings, so that helps a lot for that team as well in terms of staffing. but we've seen how important and valuable this is, and so I want to make sure that we have the best resources we can to keep doing that. Anything, Mr. Chad, on that one? All right.
Seeing questions before we move on? Seeing none, go ahead.
And then 10 is, again, just kind of just administrative thing. We have a couple lawsuits with some TID 6 properties, and we're closing TID 6 without those resolved, but we do want to provide some funds to essentially defend those lawsuits. And so that just kind of eases the burden on our tax levy by doing that. And so we can set those monies aside. Hopefully we don't need all that money, but we did want to at least be responsible with that TID dollars to have that ability to continue to provide that defense without putting a strain on the budget.
The only thing I'd add to that one is the alternative is to not close TID 6 yet, but we thought the benefits of closing it, which we've talked about at other resolutions, outweighs kind of that risk. So setting aside this funding as though we would have kept it open so that we're not in a hole. And
those are the 10 buckets. I don't know if there's anything, Mr. Chad, anything that you want to reiterate or not. If there's further questions, if we can answer those, but you kind of get a good framework of what we're thinking and some of the big buckets. And I mean, there's a lot of good stuff on here. It's unfortunate we can't do it all in 1 year.
Additional questions from the committee or from the council as a whole? Seeing none, I take that back. Alder Gerhart, go ahead.
I don't know if are we about to wrap up, or I'm just curious. Are we there's another phase?
Yes, I would have next steps
Okay.
to still kind of go through.
That's kind of what I was going to ask. So,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah, we're not done. No. We're done with the 10 groups. Yeah.
I talk fast. We could be done in 3 minutes. Let's go.
Do you want to speed it up? Is that what you're saying? I think you're asking us to move along. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
I'll talk next steps then.
Okay, go ahead.
Yep. So included in the plan is the adopted schedule. So this talks about kind of what our path forward is. So we have our presentation tonight where we talked about the mayor's proposed plan. At the next council meeting, there's a public hearing. So that's where the public can come in and share with you what their thoughts are on the mayor's proposed plan. And then, as you know, there's been a lot of committee meetings that have been occurring as well as a way for you to gather additional information too. All of that works into the council proposed amendments. So those are due February 14th at 4:30. We talked a little bit about the forms, but those are in here as well. So there's 2 forms, one if you want to change one of the existing 10 groups that are in there, either add or subtract, or there's a separate form if you want to create your own group for something new. Those then are due that Monday. I will simply put them together, help with kind of formatting and stuff, a little bit of clarity, but we won't do a lot of review on it. We're just going to put them into a packet. That packet goes out Thursday, the 17th. If you recall from CIP and budget time, usually there's staff memos associated with it, so that won't be there for this one because it's such a tight turnaround. However, the committee of the whole meeting in February where we discuss all of the council amendments, your department heads are planning to be there to answer questions and provide some context if requested at that point. So make sure you have that meeting on your calendar. And then the second meeting in March, there'll be another public hearing where the public can weigh in on the council proposed amendments. And then that same night, we'll go through each one of the amendments, just like we do for both CIP and budget, where you can amend the amendments, you can discuss them, and then you'll vote on each one of them, up or down. And then at the end of all of those, we will then adopt the investment plan. So again, this is a 30,000-foot priority setting document. The next step then will be the CIP. That's where we'll get into more of the specifics of what these priorities mean, which will then kick off in the next month or so after this is approved. So very beginning part of this important process.
And I would say, like I always mention for other amendments, talk to Misty as soon as possible if you want to do those things. I mean, the earlier the better. She's going to be your friend and very helpful with that. And don't dump it all on her at the last second. That's not fair to her. So the earlier the better. But Chad and I are both available for questions if you have questions. Misty's obviously the best, so you can make sure you talk to her earlier.
Or the other department heads too. So if you want to do a new group that has to deal specifically with another department, reach out to your department heads. We're here to help support you and make sure that you're making an educated decision with all the background and context that you need.
Randy?
Yes, Alder Wheeler, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. So just because you want to add something in here doesn't really mean you have to take it away. Because when I'm looking at, so if we wanted to add the hybrid vehicles under sustainability, that doesn't mean we have to kind of subtract something from it, does it?
So the hybrid vehicles are already in there.
Oh.
So if you wanted to add something completely brand new,
Okay.
you're going to buy the finance director a brand new desk. You want to put that in there, then you would have to do a new form to put it in. But no, you wouldn't have to take anything out because this isn't a budget. It's just that high-level priority document. Yep. But we're not prioritizing yet within those groups. So you don't have to prioritize within those. It's just what do you kind of want on the table.
You're not asking for us to prioritize, at least not at this point then.
Not within things that are already in the plan.
Correct.
Yeah, so you're just saying, what stuff do you want on the table? And then we'll figure out priorities of just the stuff on the table in future conversations.
Okay. Any additional questions? Alder Gerhart.
I think I speak for everyone. I thank you all so much for all this work on this. I know you all did this in a very short period of time, and this is really exciting. I mean, all the stuff that I read, I was just, all the possibilities for investing in this way that will reap cost savings earlier than we'd be able to do it, and that just, snowballs into the future. So this is, wow, what a cool time to be, to be a part of this process. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those same words, but I would also like to thank the mayor and Misty and Chad for inviting me in on those conversations as well as council president. And I tried not to extend my bounds, but it was a great learning experience for me, and I really do appreciate the fact that you included me. So thank you. Yeah, I think this is a great proposal, investment plan that the mayor that you have put forth. So thank you again. Is there further comments, discussion? I don't see any hands raised in Zoom. With that, I guess we would move on to a vote.
Just of the finance committee members. Yep.
Correct.
And again, this is subject to future amendments as outlined in our process.
Okay. All those in favor of, with the resolution before us, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. The motion carries. We'll move on to the rest of the agenda here. Find it. Under announcements, our next meeting is scheduled for February 8th, 2022. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Motion made by Alder Gerhart. Discussion? Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned at 6:53 p.m. Thank you.